Hello and welcome to AXSChat. I'm delighted today to be joined by Anthony Giannoumis. Anthony, we had a great conversation off air a few weeks back. You're working in academia, but also running businesses around accessibility. I thought it would be fantastic to have you on and share the work that you're doing with our community and our audience. So please, if you could tell us a bit about your background, who you are, what you're doing, and we'll take it from there.
Awesome. And thank you so much. I was telling you earlier how much of a privilege it is for me to be here and how I've been in admiration of your work and the work at AXSChat. So I'm kind of fanboying over here about how wonderful this is as an opportunity. I guess I started a career in industry, in technology industry, and then realizing that it wasn't quite the match for me that I was hoping it would be, I immediately went into academia, and I have a pretty interdisciplinary background, everything from business to public health to social and political science. I happened upon this issue of universal design of technology about 10 years ago and fell madly in love and have been putting my life at the center of that issue ever since. And part of that has been a lot of research, part of that has been a lot of technology development. But in the last couple of years, I've had the joy to launch 6 new businesses focused on various issues around universal design. And that's 6 businesses, 4 countries, 3 continents. So it's been a labor of love, and would not have been possible without the teams who are kind of making this stuff happen every day.
And you know that in itself is impressive, but I mean the diversity of the businesses and where you are. How did you decide, oh well, I'm going to do something in Ukraine versus Africa versus Scandinavia, because you're based in Scandinavia, which is a hotbed of universal design and sort of inclusive technology anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a firm believer in following your motivation. So when I find something that gets me excited, I wrap it in my both arms and run with it. So most of my initial points of contact happened through my academic work. So it was either working with a student or maybe connecting with someone at a conference, and then realizing that there was this spark of joy both in our collaboration as well as the kind of ideas we were working with. And so I'll just take an example. This company in Ukraine that we started a few years ago, it started as a random encounter at a conference. A guy just approached me. He said, I love what you're doing. And he told me a little bit about what he was doing. I said, I love what you're doing. And we connected. We started working on a new business model, and we've been kind of running with it ever since. So you never know where these opportunities come up, but it's really just about embracing it for me whenever I find it. And I'm in a very privileged position to be able to pursue these chances when I find them.
Yeah. And sorry, Antonio, were you about to say something? You look like you were. Okay, so we discussed previously that there was a lot of stuff we could learn from Africa, right? Yeah. So we're both interested and I'm beginning to do a bit more work in Africa with various different organizations. What is it about places like Africa that excites you in terms of innovation and attitudes towards technology? Because on AXSChat, we're always interested to see stuff going on outside of the UK, USA, the sort of outside of, but we still want to see what's in Europe, because there is generally a bias and a focus towards the English language. So what are the things that attracted you to work in
so I'm not African, so I don't have any ancestry unless you go back a few 100,000 years. And so I don't want to speak for any African country, but I have worked in Mozambique for the past 7 years, and the progress I've seen the country make, as well as kind of the individual elements of society make in these 7 years has been profound. Now, I've also gotten a chance to do a little bit of work in Uganda and a little bit of work in Somalia. And it seems that a lot of the African countries are positioned to leapfrog a lot of the global North countries when it comes to real social development, social impact issues. And universal design, accessibility, this is one of those issues that I see as a key opportunity structure for a lot of countries in Africa in the next 10 years. And I would, if I were a betting man, I would put my money on some of the, especially the urban environments in a lot of African countries, moving forward at a really accelerated pace on issues around accessibility, around inclusion, around diversity. And one of the reasons I attribute this to is a lot of the mentality that we have to take in the global North, the mental models we need to use in order to understand and relate to marginalized groups of people in an African context. A lot of times that's built in. It's kind of baked into the BIOS of the way people think. And that's partly to do with resource constraints. It's also partly to do with the community structures that exist in a lot of these regions. So I find that when I teach my students here in Norway about things like universal design, I have to make really compelling arguments for them to even consider it a relevant topic to relate to try to understand, to embrace. But when I pitch this work in Mozambique at the university that I work at there, it takes maybe 30 seconds. The students immediately get it, and they're iterating on it faster than I can iterate on it. So they've been they make connections almost immediately that my mind has not yet been able to approach. So I find so much inspiration, so much joy from interacting and working with them, and challenges myself to think differently about these issues of accessibility and universal design, to think radically differently. And I think that's the advantage that's coming out of a lot of these countries.
Anthony, countries like Mozambique, they came from a long history of civil war, so that kind of also impact within society that, in some cases, due to lack of resources, also led to a lot of ingenuity from people to try to solve their own problems, in order to, because there was nobody close to support those individuals in order to overcome sometimes things of their daily lives. What have you observed in Mozambique that you thought, okay, that we can learn from in relation to those approaches?
I think it's exactly what you say, is this it's kind of a bootstrap mentality, that we have all the tools that we need to solve, the soft tools, the software infrastructure that we need to solve the problems that we have. And a lot of that's gained by access to the internet, just as a fundamental kind of support. So I think that's the approach that I've seen most often, working with entrepreneurs, working with business developers in for example, Uganda. They are not willing to compromise on issues of quality, and they are very aware and vigilant of the kind of stereotypes, prejudice, and kind of reputation that Africa has in the international community. And they're aware of that kind of very one-dimensional narrative that a lot of times come out in the media when we're talking about any African country. And so they lean in hard to the opposite of that narrative, which is about, we don't need help, we need collaborators. We don't need people to, donate. We need people to work with us to find ways of solving some of the really intractable challenges that exist. And that's not to deny that there are needs. It's not to deny that there are really, really, really difficult problems that exist in these countries. It's to say that our way of thinking about how we kind of quote unquote fix those problems is maybe a little bit antiquated, and we need to move forward into a direction that's more about innovation, more about grassroots mobilizations, and finding solutions that are rooted in the community and not brought down from on high.
So I would like to introduce here a topic that we often don't talk, but it is about, we often talk a lot about technology, about things that we are discovering today, but sometimes there's an element of low tech, things that we have created in the past that sometimes are ignored. So how this, is there something that we can go back in our human history in terms of engineering that we can recover in order to somehow make our work environments, our spaces more inclusive in general?
Yeah, I think if I could answer that question honestly and effectively, I would I would be cashing a check at the bank right now. I wish I had an answer to that right off the tip of my tongue. I would say one of the technologies that's coming out that's being used quite a bit that they're leaning into, a lot of entrepreneurs in the global South, is just basic SMS. You can do so much with SMS technology, and it's kind of accessible by design because it's text-based, right? So you have a situation where someone who is blind or partially sighted can access that technology on an equal basis with others 9 times out of 10. So I think stuff like that, thinking differently about the technologies we've kind of grown used to and grown accustomed to, can be a very, very fruitful area of innovation and development and obviously access.
I think that SMS, I have heard about the death of SMS for the last decade or so. It's still going strong. And will for a long time to come. I think that we often overcomplicate things just because we can. We built industries in the West that require us to update constantly, because we've created an expectation that this stuff is innovation, and it's not necessarily making stuff better.
No.
When we add additional features to products, we create cruft. And that cruft is essentially things that you don't necessarily need, or bits of a system that don't really serve you, and we see this constantly, and to a certain extent that we built an economy around creating craft, whereas I think that there's less of that in some of the developing nations, and as a result of that, they end up with a better quality of service. Absolutely. Now, it may not look polished, but the ability to reach a wide number of people, the simplicity of delivery really means that you've got something robust. And what I see when we have this sort of Western cultural imperialism of technology coming in is like, we can solve this with our cloud-based solutions. It's all in the cloud. Well, when you've got a flaky 3G connection or you're on edge, being on the cloud is the last thing you want. And even then, also, we've got to remember that people are paying large proportion of their income to get this connectivity. So bandwidth hungry, video rich, applications don't serve the needs of the population. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, mega cities in Africa with great connectivity and everywhere where everyone's using smartphones, but it's not true for the whole of the continent. And as a result, there has been a lot more sort of thinking about functional design, I think, than somewhere where we can be a little complacent about our infrastructure. That's
I wish I could take those words and just drill them into my students' ears, because I think every computer science student starts out with putting every possible line of code that they can into every application they create, because they want to be able to show off all their knowledge and what they can do. And that mindset of going about it saying, what are the essential functions and features that we need? And focusing exclusively, vigilantly on those functions and features until we have perfected them and we have a solution that meets somebody's very narrow need. I wish I could just bake that into their mindset. And it's also extremely important in innovation and entrepreneurship. I work with so many innovators and entrepreneurs, and they start off brainstorming ideas for a solution, and you end up with this very bloated kind of, oh, it's going to do everything, and it's the kitchen sink, and it's going to, prep your coffee in the morning. And I'm sitting here thinking, but I don't need 9 out of 10 of those options. I need the one thing that you're doing well. I need you to double down on that and make that your key value proposition. So I think it scales kind of from the interface level, from that like feature and function rich application that you don't need all those features and functions, all the way up to the business model to say, we're not trying to sell something that fixes everything. We're trying to sell something that fixes a real problem, a real need that people have.
I need to tell a story that happened at one of the hackathons that I've been helping and organize. So there were different teams. So this idea of hackathon, people, we need to write code, we need developers. And we had 2 or 3 situations where the developer was asking the other elements of the team, so what do you want me to do? And he was a little desperate because the solution didn't involve any technology. And he was there looking at the others, what should I do? And he was frustrated because he had this idea, I'm probably the most important person in the team. And suddenly he realized that he wasn't.
Yeah.
So it was quite interesting to see someone coming to an hackathon, and I think that was a very valuable experience for him.
Yeah, he probably grew more in that 2 minutes than he had his whole academic career. The future is low code and no code. One of the things we're going to be putting into practice in the next few years is a very large scale training for young girls and this was the funder's original idea, was in coding. And we immediately said, yes, coding is important. And what we're going to focus on is low code, no code, and build them into coding in with that direction, with that mindset, so that the solutions that they're creating aren't just about creating the code, but actually solving a problem.
Yeah. And I think that the whole idea of citizen developer has some merit in that what we're doing is giving people the tools that they need in order to solve problems that are relevant to them. I think that I have some concerns about the low code, no code, what's going on there, because not all of the platforms have really sort of taken accessibility to heart yet. Some are.
Fair point.
Right. So we know that some of the platforms are working on components that are accessible. So that's really good, and that we hope that the rest will get there, and we encourage the rest to get there. So the danger is, it's fine when you're doing it for yourself, but these things have a life of their own.
Absolutely.
So if someone invents something nice and it's not accessible from the beginning and it goes viral, then you're excluding people. So whereas with the code, you can teach people the accessibility, with the no code, you're relying on components. So there's where the responsibility lies to be thinking about how you include people is further back in the chain of manufacture, if you like.
But then that's a new battleground that I don't know that the accessibility community, at least that I'm aware of, has taken on as a key priority, because the no-code, low-code solutions are cropping up every day. There's a new product launch. Every day there's a new company launch. And if we're not thinking ahead you know, what does this look like in 10 years when maybe no code, low code is even more mainstream? Then we're not going to be able to catch these companies at an earlier stage, exactly like you're saying, before they've launched a big, you know, viral new product. And then we end up in the same situation that we're at now with everything from, you know, even back in the 90s with websites that were still fighting with companies to make their websites accessible. So staying on the front end of this is going to be, it's going to be a challenge. It always is with accessibility.
Yeah. But that said, you know, I can still, I mean, I use automation solutions. I use sort of no code stuff myself, and you can create technologies that are assistive. So it's not that the glass is half full or half empty. I can see it from both sides. I'm on this one because I think there's a great opportunity for creating things that have real utility for individuals that can improve their lives. At the same time, we still need to address that industry, and that's hard when it's a growing industry, because we've had that. It's the same challenges every time there is a change in the industry, because you know essentially go through that cycle once again.
And there's not been a lot of market consolidation, especially for these solutions that a lot of entrepreneurs are using, whether it's, you know, just basic web application solutions or, you know, on up to, I mean, there are even kind of easy fixes and bolt-ons for machine learning and stuff like that. And, you know, I think it would behoove us to stay on trend in these areas as advocates for accessibility. Because if we can tackle the next Google before it becomes a Google, then we've created serious impact that can last generations. You know, I'm fighting the fight as much as anybody, and I always feel like I'm on the back of my heels trying to catch up with not only the tech development, but the companies, sensitizing them to the need, kind of giving them the tools that they can use to not just put accessibility into practice at a coding level, but at an institutional level.
Yeah, well, we're certainly working on the sort of institutional stuff within my own organization, and it's complex. You know, we're 110,000 people, like 6 industries, 16 different practices. You know, the matrix of these large organizations and the variety of what they do certainly makes it a challenge, but it keeps it interesting, right?
Yeah.
but at the same time, I think there is something that we can do with. So the development that I was interested in was the AI paired coding assistant in GitHub.
Oh yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking, well, that's an interest. You know, pair coding's a thing, right? So you work with like another programmer, and you help each other like iron out the glitches and solve the problems. I just wonder whether or not, you know, there's an opportunity to use these new AI pair coding assistants to help inject accessibility, because a lot of it is rules based. So
yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we could do something like that would then, you know, take the burden off the end user, because essentially we want accessibility to be sort of frictionless.
I mean, I'm optimistic about the opportunities that AI presents for accessibility solutions. I guess my only trepidation here is looking at the kind of the demographics and the diversity of the folks who are making those solutions. I think this is where we can really create value, is by ensuring that the work that we're doing in accessibility doesn't just end with an accessible platform, but actually becomes part of training, recruitment, hiring, you know, all the way up to the top levels, so that the next generation of any tech, but especially AI, is has the advantage of being developed by a very diverse group of stakeholders who, you know, I think there's science that shows will identify at an earlier stage potential problems that the AI solutions could create, and potential of, value creation benefits that it can create. So yeah, I mean, this is just another advocate, another person saying that we need more inclusive workplaces and we need more inclusive hiring practices.
Yeah. We certainly do. And I think we were talking with Heather Dowdy from Microsoft, who is who's been leading the AI for Accessibility program there. And we were talking about inclusive data sets as well, and how few there are. And so how we might then solve some of those challenges through machine learning and things like generative adversarial networks to create new data sets, because essentially also just relying on history means that we're likely to repeat it. And history's been inglorious in terms of inclusion and all of the innate prejudices that have cropped up. So there are plenty of examples of why we ought not to be relying on historical data. So how do we, are there projects that you're aware of that might be working on this? I'm aware of one certainly that's doing generating sort of images for facial recognition that can, training data sets that are taking, so they're taking thousands of images of people of different ethnicities, and then they're putting them into these generative adversarial networks to create tens of thousands or millions of images to then train the AI on. Are there other things that you're aware of in this space that similar things?
I get involved in these AI conversations, and I should always put out before I start that conversation that I don't know anything about AI. But I do know the people who are leading the edge when it comes to our ways of thinking. So you probably know her as well as I, Jutta Treviranus at the Ontario College of Art and Design. I just had her on my podcast as a guest. She is light years ahead of any of us when it comes to how we think, not only about the data sets, but about the whole process and the ill effects that can come out of not recognizing the diversity of the human experience. So I would just, my response here is going to be, check out Jutta. She's amazing. The other group that I think is doing a lot of interesting work is the research institutes, and there's a lot of them around the world, but there's one here in Oslo at my university that's working on explainable AI, so that it's not this black box effect where we put a lot of data in and we get some cool stuff out, but then we don't really know what's happening in the middle, but actually being able to pick apart and understand a little bit more critically what that performance is or is like. So I think those are the two places I would kind of direct people and to try to better understand these issues, but they're super complex. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out here, because this is a good way of thinking that I actually learned from TikTok of all places, is our mindsets are always going to be bound in time. Right. So what you said about, okay, we can't use historical data because you go back not too long ago and there are many large groups of people who weren't even considered human. So even if we were to say we're going to take a human population data around that, looking at it historically, you're not going to be tackling a lot of groups of people. So we're always going to be bound in time. We always have to think of it in that way. And so what our thinking is now will always be more closed-minded, more prejudicial than it will be in 10, 20, 30 years. And this is just to take the words of a person more famous than I, and the name is going to escape me now, but and I'll paraphrase as well. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it points towards justice. I think it was Nelson Mandela said that. So we think about how our evolution as a society will continue to progress. We will hopefully be continuing to progress towards justice. And in doing so, it's going to be about recognizing an even greater diversity of humanness. And we already know this in the disability rights community. I mean, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities defines disability as an evolving concept. What we understand as disability today is not what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Even just people on the autism spectrum, that concept was not available to us as a mental model even in the 90s, early 70s, 60s. I mean, it just wasn't the same way of thinking. So we have to update how we think and we have to update how we talk, because at any given time, we will always be more closed-minded, more closed off than we will be in years to come.
So you just mentioned models, and models of disability is something that sort of comes up a lot, and there has been a tendency to follow a medical model for a long time. Scandinavia, UK, much more social model based. Both have issues. Mm-hmm. I recently sort of came across another one, which was like a bi-ability model, which recognizes that sometimes you're disabled and sometimes you're not, and it was kind of interesting to sort of see those, but then that gets into the whole sort of concept of identity and how do you identify when you sometimes consider yourself disabled and sometimes you consider yourself not, and I can relate, right? Because as someone with sort of neurodivergent conditions, sometimes I don't feel disabled at all. I certainly don't look it. Other times it's really debilitating. You get into certain situations, you fail to do things that people find perfectly easy. So I think these models are going to evolve too, and that will change our understanding of stuff. But and I guess that some of that is going to relate and impact on legislation and regulation and how we do things too. I think that hopefully, though, coming full circle back to where we started, that sort of design for all approach, the inclusive design approach, will remain, and essentially that what we will end up with is ways of doing business, of building technology that understand that there is diversity in people and that we interact with things in different ways, that cultures have different nuances in how they interact with things, even and that through a process of consultation and consideration that we can design better tech, better systems, hopefully better, more inclusive societies as well. So aside from technology and aside from design, what are the other things that sort of do you get involved in terms of how you can sort of influence the world of inclusion?
Yeah, so my, I guess you could say my career trajectory has really been focused on bringing the principles of accessibility and universal design into radically different spheres, as radically as I can get, really. And so one of the first kind of bridges I started to connect was with the kind of theoretical as well as practical approaches to innovation. So looking at not just taking tech and retrofitting it, or even just designing tech in a way that's accessible, but really conceiving of problems and solutions using a universal design accessibility mindset. So that way, as you continue down that journey as an innovator and an entrepreneur, all of the work that you're going to be producing is going to have those value systems embedded in it. And this comes from like broader sociological theories about the relationship between technology and society and all that. But that's neither here nor there. The important point here is taking the value systems that we share, that's all wrapped up in human rights, but also in technology and design, and using that to seed the same sort of kind of concentrated ethics in other areas. And innovation is one, entrepreneurship is another. The other area that I've been working in, as I already mentioned, in Mozambique and Uganda, is international development. So the international development space has largely ignored issues around disability rights. There are some pockets where disability rights is a key consideration, but if I could be super critical here, whether it's funding that's going to international development programs or it's the implementation of those programs, you'd be hard pressed to find something that is truly inclusive, even if they're inclusive by name. And that's because people with disabilities often get left off of that list of, we're going to help all of these groups of people. Oh yeah, And then we also need to think about accessibility and disability related issues. So I've been trying to make sure that that work has been connected a little bit more closely, so that when we're going about in any international development process, we're again baking in accessibility universal design at the outset. And another great person who's working in this field, who's doing his PhD in Portugal, I think at the University of Lisbon, is a man named George Manique, and it's Manique. So you can Google him, find him. He is a genius when it comes to this issue of international development and accessibility, building it into funding models, building it into practical implementation models. He's been working in this space for his whole life. So he is a far greater expert than I am to speak about it, but I've kind of taken on his mindset and tried to make sure that the work that I'm doing in the Global South is really anchored in the same human rights, accessibility, universal design, technology, principles and practices, so that as we're doing more work out in the world, it's reaching more people.
So Anthony, following that, so I presume that over the last couple of years, you have done a lot of ideation, a lot of that type of work. So, how can we make sure that we are able to listen to everyone? How we can establish that environment that, that when you are in Mozambique, you are able to create a space where people, you are not just talking with the experts, but you are talking with the individual that we are going to serve. And now that we are online, we also, the issue is even more difficult because we have to connect digitally. How can we make sure that we actually provide the space where we can have that listening opportunity to make sure that we don't end up just talking between ourselves?
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the $1 million question is, and when I talk to my students about these issues, one of their first kind of pushbacks is, how can I possibly work with the full diversity of the human spectrum in my design and my creation of my new technologies? And there's not a lot of good there's not a lot of good ways of thinking. I mean, we have things like the WCAG standards, which fix some things for some people some of the time, but we don't really have a solution in any way, shape, or form that fits with the universal design mindset. And we don't have solutions that deal with intersectionality, for example. So like, we can kind of figure out how we can work things for some people with disabilities some of the time, but we don't know anything about what it is to experience a barrier accessing or using technology for a woman with a disability, an older woman with a disability, older woman who lives in a rural area with a disability, an older transgender woman who lives in a rural area with a disability. I mean, when you start stacking these identities, marginalized identities on one another, our ability, I think just cognitively, but certainly scientifically, it just falls flat because we're so used to, for so long, putting people into boxes. You're a person with a disability, so we know what to do for you. You're a woman, so we know what to do for you. You're a racial ethnic minority, so we know what to do. But we've just now gotten to a point, thanks to Kim Crenshaw, the genius behind intersectionality, we're just now getting to the point where we can even acknowledge that these identities can coexist and that the challenges, barriers, discrimination that these individuals experience are exponentially greater than if it's just one identity alone. And so we don't know what it's like to develop technology for people who have intersectional identities, people who hold intersectional identities. But I think that becomes the solution, is we find ways of working with, collaborating with people who have multiple marginalized identities. And in doing so, this is one of the core value systems of universal design, make it work for the most marginalized group, the most extreme users, and it will work better for everybody. So I think it's about tapping into those communities, working in collaboration with those communities, letting them lead and drive the process, questioning all of our assumptions and biases that we bring to the table whenever we're trying to do this sort of work. It's again an evolving issue that we'll never be able to nail down. And this frustrates my students more than anything, is because they always want, give me the answer. What's the answer? What's going to be the answer on the test? What's the answer to this problem? There's no answer. We have to stay vigilant. We have to learn. We have to empathize and find ways of bringing everybody into to belong.
And like one of my university teachers told me, now that you finish, you are free to go to the world and learn and study by yourself. That's why you are here.
Yes, yes. And maybe that's an area that I think we could really do well to consider in the universal design space. So we've been trying a lot to bring universal design into hard skills, acquiring hard skills like coding, right? But we haven't, I think, done enough to start thinking about how we can integrate a universal design mindset into meta skills and the power skills. So what does a universal design leader look like? What does a universal design creative thinker look like? What does a universal design critical thinker look like? I think that, what does it mean to be able to learn how to learn about an issue like universal design? I think that's a really compelling way of bridging this gap between a topic that has historically been very anchored in practical reality and start bringing it into more mindset and more ways of thinking rather than only focusing on ways of doing. I always tell, I get the pushback that I'm sure everyone has always heard in the accessibility space, it's going to cost too much money. And I always push back and I say, you know what? It costs you nothing to change your mind. Change your mind about this issue and it's absolutely free. And you will figure it out along the way. You will innovate new ways of working. You will innovate new ways of doing this. But as long as you have that mental block up, it is going to cost too much because you're not going to be working in that mindset.
Yeah, I think that sometimes, fixing it after the fact costs a lot of money. And so people get scared of that. It's not that expensive to include people from the beginning. So, that mindset change is really important. So thank you. We've pretty much hit the buffers. Not in terms of the conversation, but in terms of time. So it's been a real pleasure. We need to also thank Barclays Access, MyClearText, and Microlink for keeping us on air and keeping us going, and also acknowledge Debra, who's not here today because she's taking some time out, but she'll be with us on Tuesday. So look forward to you joining us then for Q&A on Twitter.
I'm super excited and I'm so grateful again. And Debra's one of my personal superheroes, so I can't wait to have a chat with her on Tuesday.